Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. So we are privileged and honored to have Dr. Lori Ploutz-Snyder with us. She is the Dean of the School of Kinesiology over at University of Michigan. And before that, she was a very highly decorated scientist over at NASA, doing all kinds of exercise physiology research and countermeasures research. Oh my God, countermeasures research. And before that, she had several teaching positions, including at Syracuse University. Overall, fantastic researcher, academic, and scholar. Her CV reads like a novel. It is fantastic. We are very, very excited to have her here to learn more about what her journey has been like, what her research is like, and what the future of aerospace medicine looks like. So without any further ado, we'll turn it over to our guest.
So I've got to say, you missed the most important part of my credentials, which was the postdoc at Michigan State.
No. Okay. Well, I'm glad we met. Well, I'm glad we got it now. I missed that. Yes. So she's a Spartan. That's good.
And then they hired me at Michigan, and I was sort of surprised that I got the job. But
we won't hold the defect, the leaving of Michigan State for a University of Michigan out of all places against you.
Yes, but, please don't hold that against me. And it was a cool job at Michigan because kinesiology is its own school. So how cool is that?
Fantastic.
So I guess I'll give a little introduction and talk about some of the questions that you sent me, and then we'll have other questions and a conversation, right? And since there are so few of us here, please interrupt, just shout out if you want some follow-up or some additional information. And thank you to Jill Slade for inviting me to the group or introducing me. So when I was doing my postdoc at Michigan State, I worked with Jill. It was just only a couple of years ago. And so nice to see you. So one of the things I want to talk a little bit about, and I won't spend too much time with this, is I had a really unusual academic journey. And students are often interested in this because I think I'm kind of a poster child for things don't always work out how you planned, and that can be okay. And so I was a swimmer, collegiate swimmer, swam for Ohio University. I was a scuba diver, and I loved exercise physiology. And so when I went into a PhD program, I wanted to combine all of those together. And there weren't very many programs. So I went to one at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver because I thought that would be cool. And it was a hyperbaric physiology program in exercise physiology. I thought it was going to be great. It did not turn out to be great at all. That's a story of its own. But I thought that's what I wanted to do. And I started doing that, and I didn't like it. And this seems like every student's worst fear. What if I made the wrong choice? What if I went to this school and I hated it? And I'm here to tell you that that can be okay because I didn't care much for it. And I was talking to a faculty member at Ohio University that I had worked with at the time, and he had left Ohio University and was working for NASA. And he heard that I wasn't very happy in the PhD program at Simon Fraser. And long story short, he had an opportunity there that was like an 8-month kind of teaching position in this summer program. And he said, why don't you come down here, see if you like this kind of research and do this program. And then if you like it, we have some affiliate PhD programs. And if you don't like it, you can go back there. And I went down there and I loved it. And that's what really got my interest in the spaceflight aspect really launched. But I always liked exercise physiology because I started as a biology major, and I just loved the physiology. I love the complexity of the physiology and almost the storytelling of the physiology. And exercise physiology was just that much better because I was a swimmer and because it made the physiology far more complex and interesting. And so there are very few stresses to the physiologic system that are any bigger than exercise, especially maximal exercise. And I also love the interdisciplinary multi-system physiology. How does one system affect another? I was never really a big lover of the cellular and molecular biology and the single pathways. And I do respect the beauty in those and the ability to know the entire literature and to really get it. But I am just not one of those people. And I really like the big picture and the organ system physiology. So I ended up completing my PhD work down at the Kennedy Space Center in an exercise physiology lab. I thought, oh, this NASA stuff is great. I am going to stay with NASA. I'm going to do a postdoc with NASA. I'm going to have a whole career with NASA. I'm never going to leave it. I love it. I love Florida. I love everything about it. And guess what? That didn't work out either. At that time, NASA decided to reorganize everything, and they sent all of their life science research to Johnson Space Center in Texas. And the investigators, the scientists that were at Kennedy, they were told to just go to Texas and fit in there. And the people in Texas didn't really want them there. And so there were all this political strife, and that didn't work out. I ended up not going. And that was sort of last minute. So I didn't know what I was going to do. And I ended up in the postdoc at Michigan State because it was a friend of my advisor, and, just kind of happenstance. Loved it. I was going to stay at Michigan State for a really long time, but guess what? That didn't work out either. And the grant ran out, and we were in between grants, and we had applied for another grant, but we didn't know if we were going to get it. So I thought, well, I better apply for some jobs just in case. And then I got one of those jobs, and that actually worked out for a long time. But then, somewhat to my surprise, come 20 some years later, I get this call from someone at Johnson Space Center saying, hey, is there any chance you're available? We have new exercise equipment on the space station. We need research on exercise countermeasures. For the first time ever, there's exercise equipment that is robust enough that you could actually get a good workout on it, and it might be effective. We need someone to lead this. There's a research program, there's a strategic planning piece, there's this operational space flight. And I said, no, not really interested. I'm happy here. But the more I heard about it, the better it sounded. And I ended up going there. And the thing that was really cool about going there was that it was sort of like being at Kennedy Space Center all over again, but 20 some years later. So you never know what's going to happen. And it was what had happened in that 20 years was really a good thing for exercise physiology, in as much as they were ready to do space flight exercise training studies. And the goal was to develop the research goal was to develop an exercise program that was effective for cardiovascular, skeletal muscle, neuromuscular, vestibular, if we could work that in, bone, and behavioral health, meaning help people not get depressed or miss their families too much or things like that. And so that really appealed to me because it was taking the organ system exercise physiology to a new level. And I had to really learn a lot about bone. That was the one area that I knew so little about. And that job ended up being maybe 50% research, some operational space flight, and then some strategic planning for a Mars mission. And that part was really super cool because for the first time I got to be on the other side of the grant writing game, in terms of how do you write a grant solicitation? How much money should we put in this? Is this work we could do in-house? Is this work that we should have people apply for grants? And so I think it's that combination of things that got me the job at Michigan in the dean's office, because that too is a mix of strategic planning and research and management of people. So back to the questions that you really ask about, which were much more related to musculoskeletal health and exercise countermeasures. And I'm going to broaden that a little bit to beyond just musculoskeletal health. But if you think about what happens during long duration space flight, the main thing that you would think of is the unloading. And so this is just not being against gravity, not terribly different from bed rest, which is in fact a space flight analog, and the lack of fitness of any system that occurs with detraining or less use. But there are some other things that exacerbate the whole situation that you might not think of. So one is the diet and the lack of fresh foods and the high sodium content of the packaged foods and the headward fluid shifts that cause some nasal stuffiness that make things taste not quite as good, which makes the people put extra salt on it because things that they thought tasted pretty good on Earth taste too bland in space because your sense of taste changes. And then there's the disrupted sleep due to the circadian rhythm. So I forget the statistics off the top of my head, but when you're on the space station traveling 17,000 miles an hour, minute, I don't know, really fast, you get something like a dozen sunrises and sunsets in a day. And so this just wreaks havoc with the circadian rhythms and sleep. Then it's a pretty stressful job. And that some of the things that make it stressful are that each 15 minutes of the day is scheduled. You know, you do this task for 15 minutes and then this task for 15 minutes, and you can get behind or you could get too far ahead. And there's a lot of, it sounds so glamorous to be on the space station and run these experiments, but there's a lot of routine, like keeping the space station running. Then you're with an international crew, so there could be some cultural issues. And then you have this whole teamwork. Imagine living in a tin can the size of a 3-bedroom house with 6 people from probably 3 or 4 different countries for 6 months straight with all this other stress. So and there's some radiation exposure. It's not terrible, but there's some more than the usual background radiation exposure. There's potentially emotional stress if something goes wrong at home. So Scott Kelly was in one of our experiments, and his twin brother, Mark Kelly, was on the space station. No, Scott was on the space station when his sister-in-law was shot. And having to deal with that from afar. And so there are a lot of other things that exacerbate the unloading. For bone, obviously doesn't change and adapt as nearly as quickly as muscle, but causes some other problems. So the unloading causes demineralization of bone, perfectly normal response, which gives more calcium in the blood. And that there are urinary problems with having too much calcium in your blood, right? Kidney stones.
Kidney stones, yeah.
Among others. So there's this story that you can weave of why would you exercise to prevent kidney stones? How much exercise would you need to do? Okay, gosh, never really thought about that before. There are also a lot of really significant balance problems immediately upon returning from space flight. So there's some space motion sickness in the first few days of flight, but a bigger problem is that when the astronauts return, and if you've ever watched these landings where they land in Kazakhstan and they like bring them out on this stretcher and in a wheelchair and they carry them around because they probably wouldn't walk very well and all the cameras are on them, there are some really significant balance problems that recover fairly quickly, like over days. But if there were to be an emergency landing, this would be a problem. And if there were to be a need, like landing on Mars and needing to be autonomous there and not have a ground crew to come and pull you out, this could be a problem. And for years and years and years, it was thought that this was all of vestibular origin. So it was the unloading of the otoliths in the inner ear, and the brain and the nervous system adapted to that. And then when the otoliths were reloaded, they couldn't interpret that data. And this was the source of the balance issues. And this was the dogma for, I don't know, 50 years. And some of the work that we did when I was there really shook that up quite a bit and pointed to the afferent feedback from the muscles as being really critically important. And the piece of evidence, and this was like a big breakthrough, that's why I'm telling you about this, is that we also did a bed rest study when I was there. And I can tell you more about that if you're interested. That's quite the experience. It was a 70-day bed rest study. And we were able to bring the people out of bed rest. So it's head down, tilt bed rest. We were able to take them out of bed rest and put them head down, tilt in a van and drive them over to a lab where we could have what we called fresh bed rest subjects. And they stood up for the first time in 70 days and went through this whole test battery that's for balance. It's an obstacle course and posture tests, and they left no stone unturned in that regard. And it was stunning that they performed exactly the same as the astronauts. But their vestibular system was not unloaded during bed rest. And we had done these same tests on astronauts, and the bed rest subject profile, especially the controls who did no exercise, mirrored exactly the astronauts.
So would they kind of like, was it just general instability, or were they like one-sided, or what was that like?
It's general instability, dizziness, way too much head movement for the task. One of the things that's really noticeable is changing direction with the head. So they would turn their head and then the body would turn and then they would move. So these delays in reaction.
Is that something that happens? So the turning of the head before the body, is that something that they kind of learn to do in a microgravity environment, just in space? Like they learn to kind of turn their head before they move, or is it just?
We don't know.
They just kind of get shaken up, yeah.
Or just motor planning slightly disrupted. Basically, any test of postural stability, eyes open, eyes closed, moving platform, moving background, still, big impairments.
Gotcha. Yeah, one thing that kind of popped in my head when you were talking about the food, right, on the space station. So when you're up in a microgravity environment, you have like, you get kind of nauseous and you're throwing up a lot. So what's like the nutrient intake like? So, I mean, when you're eating food, it's food you add extra salt to, but then you're having a harder time keeping it down. So
the nausea only lasts a couple days, so that's not really a big factor.
Okay.
The other thing is we don't really know what the astronauts eat. They do these 3-day dietary recalls. Don't know if anyone's ever tried doing one of these yourself, but
Nope.
It's kind of hard. And when you get busy, you have a tendency to think, oh, I'll write that down later. And then maybe you do, maybe you don't. People tend to underestimate what they eat. So, the 3-day dietary recall is only as good as the recaller is. And they have tried to barcode the food and then you have to scan it every time you eat, but that just isn't very practical. There's also a fair amount of trading food. So each country sends their own food systems, but depending who's up there, they might like the Japanese food better or, so some other country's food. For a long time, people were not taking in enough calories.
Okay.
And that's been mostly fixed.
Oh, how?
Improving the food supply. So making more variety, more things that people like, giving the individual crew members some more autonomy in what to take so they can pick things off of a menus or when they make their packing list. And then encouraging people to make sure you eat enough and trying to keep track of it better.
Yeah, but I was wondering if
the weight loss was a major confound to the maintenance of muscle and bone for quite some time. I think we're on top of that now.
Okay. Yeah, I was wondering because you'd mentioned that there's the headward movement basically of your bodily fluids, and there's that nasal congestion. You can't really taste things as well. So I was wondering if they had fixed that situation of not getting enough calories by making the food, I guess, more intense in taste. So things that are savory are savorier. So it kind of overcomes the nasal kind of congestion, and now they want to eat. But
yeah, and there's a whole food lab that deals with these exact issues. And one of the fun things about working at Johnson Space Center was they always needed subjects to come in and taste the food. And they had these little booths. And so they put something in a cup and spin it around, and you'd eat it and rate it. And then they'd give you another one. And it was kind of fun.
It's a nice snack break. Yeah.
Yeah. But a lot of the stuff was pretty bad tasting.
Oh. I heard that they would just kind of go to a grocery store and then get the food and then rehydrate it or dehydrate it and then package it. So was that in the process, that's what kind of made it taste bad, or what? There was stuff that they were making at Johnson. What was that?
I don't know how they were making all of the food. I think it is mostly commercial over-the-shelf food or fresh food that is repackaged. But you can also buy some foods that way, like the military uses them, and campers and those preppers and those kind of people. There are commercially available sources for these things. But in the end, though, the lack of access to fresh food, nobody likes that.
Right.
The crew members don't like it. The nutritionists don't like it. So there are always these experiments going on with growing plants. You said there was a botanist in the group from time to time. There are always some kind of interesting botany experiments going on, and that's really fun for the crew members to grow things. Yeah,
I can imagine. It's really interesting. One of the questions that we kind of had submitted previously, I thought would be really interesting to bring up would be, can you kind of discuss how microgravity research or bed rest research could be applied to patients here on Earth? So if there is somebody that is, just kind of sequestered to their bed for whatever reason, how can physicians on Earth kind of use the research that you have done and your friends have done to improve kind of patient health and comfort and quality of health?
This is one of my favorite questions. Because when we did the bed rest study, we had several groups. We had a do nothing control group that they were just in bed for 70 days. So we were able to really carefully look at the time course of loss in pick your favorite system. And then there was a high intensity exercise group who did the same exercise protocol that we were testing on the space station. So it was running, cycling, weightlifting, some high intensity aerobic intervals, pretty high intensity resistance training. And then there was a group that did that exercise and also testosterone injections. And they were cycled in kind of a fancy low dose way. And the exercise program, with or without testosterone, was really close to completely effective in mitigating all of the changes of bed rest. Like shockingly so. There are no drugs that have that kind of potency to minimize the deconditioning. So 1 hour of exercise per day mitigated 23 hours of lying in bed. And it wasn't perfectly 100%, but it was so close that for the purposes of this, I'm going to call it completely effective. It was at least good enough, put it that way.
Yeah.
So the number, so the classic bed rest hospital-based deconditioning is someone who starts out a bit weak, often because they're older, but not always. And the 1 or 2 or 3 weeks in bed rest is the final straw that pushes them out of the independent living category into needing a rehab hospital, a nursing home, assisted living, etc. I bet everyone on this Zoom knows someone for whom this has happened. I mean, it is classic, millions and millions of people. So often you can think of bed rest as kind of the final straw. You take someone who's already fairly weak and it's just enough to push them below the threshold for independent living. There's also the younger, healthier person who just suffers some deconditioning and would like to get back faster. And then there's the more long-term bed rest, hospital-based deconditioning. So an extreme case, spinal cord injury, but something less dramatic than that is someone who's in the ICU for a month or something like that. I think, and now we go on to my personal opinion. I am not representing NASA, the University of Michigan, or any other entity on this. I think this is a tremendous problem that we as a community could really be doing something about. There are physical therapists and occupational therapists in the hospitals, but they only go to the patients that have a PT or an OT order. And you only get a PT order, I think, if you have an orthopedic injury. Not too many cancer patients are getting PT orders, etc. Not too many people in the ICU. How often does a physical therapist go into the ICU? Hardly ever. Depends where you are, maybe never. So I think this is a huge gap between, say, physical therapy, kinesiology, exercise physiology, clinical medicine. And there's a lot of opportunity for research. There's a lot of opportunity for clinical practice. There are not a lot of hospitals that see a lot of cancer patients that have an exercise service. They should. University of Michigan doesn't have one. We should. I think you could put a supine cycle in an ICU and really improve people. But I think there is a huge space for prevention of hospital-based deconditioning, and that it would have so many other great side effects. So that's my soapbox for today. Any of you planning to go to medical school, you might want to check into that.
Think about that. Yeah. I think even from like personal experience when, I was like relegated to bed rest, after, I think you called it deconditioning, basically tore my ACLs. Um, when you're just kind of laid in bed for a few weeks, I don't have like a quantifiable kind of report on it, but it definitely, you feel weaker. You're kind of a bit more lethargic, not just because, you're kind of worn out, but definitely less stable, I think. So,
Oh
and that
yeah,
was just,
and
just
you're
from exercise.
losing. I don't. It's in one of my papers. I don't remember, but we actually calculated percent loss per day in muscle strength and muscle size.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
I mean, it's less than 1% a day, but it's very linear day after day after day. So it does add up.
Okay.
And if you're already quite strong to begin with, it might not be noticeable in your everyday life. But if you were an athlete, it will definitely be noticeable. And if you were weak to begin with, it will definitely be noticeable.
I'll take a quick break. Does anybody have any questions that they would like to ask? I mean, I could probably go on forever asking questions, but give a chance for other people to ask anything.
Sure. I actually, so I was looking at some of your papers, and I noticed that you wrote one on like the sex and gender differences in musculoskeletal health. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you found from that paper.
Yeah, we didn't find anything really stunning. So there are plenty of known sex differences in muscle and bone size, just on average. So men on average have more muscle mass than women. So those are well known, and we confirmed those to be the case in our population and in the astronauts too. That being said, there's quite a bit of overlap of these bands. So some very strong women are quite a lot stronger than some of the weaker men. And so there's quite a lot of overlap of these groups. There are some also kind of well-known sex differences related to kind of strength versus endurance, with men faring better on the sort of peak strength and power, and women faring better on the endurance measures, especially if you correct for muscle mass or body weight or something like that. What we were really trying to look at with the most recent study was, do they change the same? So is the rate of decline the same? And one of the things we were chasing after was the supposition that maybe women didn't decline as rapidly because they were either starting at a lower level or because their generally endurance is better. Would that be better preserved? And chasing after, maybe we should send women to Mars because they'll fare better physiologically. And that didn't really pan out. In terms of the rate of change being pretty similar. So it was a little bit of a boring paper, in my opinion.
That kind of leads me, I think I was looking at another paper of yours that was kind of talking about rehabilitation, rapid recovery, and some upper and lower leg muscles. And so you had mentioned that there were a few muscle groups that did recover fairly quickly with rehabilitation, but I did notice you said there were very important muscles like quadriceps and hamstrings that did not quite recover as quickly, within a short period of time. So how do you go about building back strength in these very, very important muscle groups like your quads and your hamstrings, maybe post-flight or post-bed rest, and kind of get things back up to speed?
You build them back the same way you normally would. It's just you could expect a little bit different of a rate.
Okay. Is there like a specific... Oh, go ahead.
So we had, in that bed rest study, we had a very set reconditioning program. And it was, honestly, it was mostly set so that we could convince the IRB that we were returning the participants back into their normal life in relatively similar condition to which we found them. And so we wanted to have as rapid of a rehab program as we could come up with. We didn't really have a big evidence base to draw from, because whoever does rapid rehab. So we did the best we could with it and then documented it. And then it was sort of after the study, we realized, oh, this would be really interesting to study the rehab piece too. So it was a maybe 75% science, 25% art on this rapid rehab, where the trainers were told, here's the program, but try to advance them through this program as fast as you possibly can. So first day out of bed rest, they need to do 3 laps around the hallway. If they could do 5, do that, but don't try the stairs yet. And then the second day, okay, try the stairs, do at least 1 set of stairs. But if you could do a lot of stairs, yeah, do that. And so it was customized aggressive rehab.
Okay. Gotcha. Okay. One question that we did have that was submitted, I think was pretty useful regardless of whatever area of study you happen to be in, is what would you say are the most useful skills that you developed kind of through your career progression, maybe at NASA, and that you currently bring to your position as dean? Just general professional skills, personal skills, these kinds of things.
Yeah. So all of the skills that I'm going to say don't have a whole lot to do with science. And I'll preface this with saying this. I'm going to say the science skills have to be assumed. So to be successful in your career, if you're a doctor or a researcher, you have to be competent in the area. So I'm not saying that's not important. I'm saying that is a baseline. That is number one importance for everyone. So I don't need to talk about that, because depending on what kind of work you do, you would have a different competency set. But the skills that I think are common and not really taught, but maybe should be, or at least developed, will be things like listening, empathy, negotiation. I took this amazing negotiation class with NASA. And I was put in the class because, I don't know, they thought I needed it, I guess. And we had to do a lot of negotiating with our international partners. And sometimes there were language barriers, but there were always cultural differences. And I didn't know about them at first. And I made a couple of mistakes. I can tell you about some of those. Some of them are sort of funny, but my main point would be paying attention to things like that. And then negotiating gracefully, not negotiating like a bulldozer, sort of my way or the highway, let me talk you into doing it my way, but really coming to as much of a win-win situation as you can, or understanding what currency the other person is trying to negotiate in. Like I might be negotiating in money and you're negotiating in time. And if we could just really figure that out, we could probably come up with a good compromise. So that's probably the most useful, and I think could apply to almost any kind of work. Strategic planning is another one. And so being able to think very intentionally about next week, next month, next year, 3 years out, 5 years out, 10 years out, and make decisions based on that trajectory. And it's easier said than done.
Yeah, in terms of
skills like that.
Right. Like 2 things that kind of popped up while we were discussing it. The first one was, would love to hear about those like stories that you have about the cultural differences. I think it'd be really useful. Second thing is about what you just mentioned. So planning in terms of, next day, next week, 3 years, 5 years. How do you kind of go about planning, ahead in your future when you're not entirely sure what it will look like? I mean, you can plan, right? So 3 years from now, I want to be doing X, Y, and Z. So how do you plan with the increasing degree of unknown as you go further into the future?
Yeah, and we all got really good at that in this past year, right?
Yeah.
So how do you do that? Lots of contingency plans and really thinking out, do I really need to do this tomorrow? Is this going to actually affect next week or the next week? Or, so I think being very intentional about what you do. So a great example is, how are we going to hold classes in the fall? Right? Are they going to be in person? All of them? None of them? Some of them? If some of them, which ones? Does it depend how many people are vaccinated? Does it depend how many parties there are on campus? Does it depend on some other stuff? Are people going to have to wear masks? How close can they sit? Like, none of this is known, right? And this is for the fall. And so you can do a lot of scenario planning. And okay, I can tell you that we have tables and chairs in our classrooms, and we can really quickly set them up to be 6 foot separation, 3 foot separation, or packed in to meet the fire code. So that's a perfect example of, I know what I don't know. I don't know when I'm going to know it, but I'm prepared to deal with it whenever I find out. So I'd love to know August 1st how many people I can put in the classrooms.
Right.
But I probably only need 3 days to arrange those classrooms.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what about the registrar? And so this isn't a really great answer, but should I worry today about my classroom configurations, or should I spend today working on something else? And it's a constant juggling of priorities.
Right.
And making sure that you do the tasks or answer the questions in the right order, and know what is the effect of not knowing that or not being able to do that. Is that a catastrophic problem or a small problem? And what would I do about that problem? And anyone planning anything this year, I'd say from a university president all the way down to the, janitor, we've all had to get really good at this, and a lot of things have gone wrong. and so, then what do you do? How do you salvage it?
Fair enough. And would you be willing to share some of your cultural?
So I have 2 favorite stories. One thing is that we did quite a bit of work with our Russian counterparts and our Japanese counterparts. And the Japanese, for whatever reason, they were signing up for our research study like crazy. I think they were really interested in the development of the exercise program and some practical reasons. And almost always the JAXA astronauts would sign up and be in our program. And so the first time we got one, we were pretty excited. And after we had several, we felt like we really had this down. We knew they have like basically personal trainers that work with the astronauts. We knew the JAXA, that's the Japanese Space Agency trainers. We knew the flight surgeons. Our team had gotten really good at doing the tests and the measurements. And so I stopped attending the tests. And my team loved it that I stopped attending the tests. And I think they liked me. I may not ever know for sure, but for them, it indicated that I had so much confidence in their ability that I did not need to be there monitoring them and watching them and making sure they did it right. So it was a big vote of confidence for me to not come to the tests and, even when I was there, it was not like I was running the test. I would stand in the back and chat and, maybe throw in my 2 cents here and there. But from our very American point of view, this was a good thing to do because my presence there was not really necessary. It showed I had confidence in the team, that I had confidence in the JAXA team and the JAXA crew members, and this was all going smoothly. And I didn't know for months that I had seriously offended the Japanese flight surgeon who viewed my not coming as a snub, and that I didn't think it was important enough to be bothered to come and attend. And I had no idea that I had really insulted this person, maybe more than just this person, until she finally told me and asked, why was I not coming? Because I thought we were kind of pretty good friends. So did she, which is why she asked that. And the other thing that I learned the hard way was that when the Japanese crew members and flight surgeons, when they said, I think that would be difficult, that meant there is no possible way. And if they said, oh, I don't know, that might be kind of hard, that meant there's probably no way. But those statements were far more definitive than what I realized. So when they said, oh, I think that would be difficult, I started I went into problem solving mode. Like, oh, well, we could do this and we could do this and we could do this. And then that would still be difficult. And, oh, okay, well, then we could do this and we could, and no, that was the signal for no.
No fly, no go.
No. The other funny one was that I didn't know anything about the Russian science culture. And that proved to be problematic because, first of all, they have very different federal guidelines than we have. And so I had been brought up in the American research system, which has all kinds of federal compliance, IRBs, coercion rules. You can't overpay participants to be in a study because that might be like too much of an incentive. Astronauts have to volunteer and consent to be in research studies just like anyone else. And we were trying to do some joint studies with the Russians because there are only 6 people flying in space at a time. So you could double your throughput if you could enroll Russian subjects too. And we were just getting nowhere. And there was a huge language barrier because I spoke no Russian. I tried, I still spoke no Russian. Their English was shaky. So we would have to go through translators a lot. And I came to learn that their system is entirely different. So their cosmonauts are required to participate in research. That is part of the job description. They are paid on a totally different pay scale it's sort of like an a la carte menu. And depending what you do, you get more money. So if you clean the toilet, you get more money. And if you do this study, you get more money. And that's how it builds the salary structure. So our IRB said these were coercive amounts of money you couldn't possibly pay a subject, but that was part of their pay structure. It was just a collision at every step of the way. And so it made me challenge some of the assumptions of, oh, and why do we do it like this? But the funniest story of all was that my counterpart on the Russian side was when I was there, she was about 80 to 87 years old. And she had been with the Russian Space Agency since its inception. And her father had been a high-ranking KGB officer. And so she was really a high-profile Russian lady. Her English was fantastic because she got to study at Columbia University way back when Russia was closed. And what I didn't know was that she could really do or say almost anything she wanted, and everyone was to agree with her and nod. And she was an accomplished scientist, so that wasn't really an issue. But the first time I went to Russia, we had a big meeting, and it was a science meeting, but they took notes and then had them translated into all the languages of the people who were there. And then we had to go over the minutes of the notes and make sure that everyone agreed on what we had agreed to do next. So it was the most elaborate note-taking process ever. And then at the end of the meeting, and I had been tipped off to this, at the end of the meeting, they would, Anessa, the high-ranking Russian lady, would offer a toast to how successful the meeting was. And everyone had to toast. And then the highest ranking people of the other agencies could then have the opportunity to offer a toast. And then anyone who participated could offer a toast. And the more toasts, the more successful the meeting. So some of us in our group were told, like, someone has got to offer a toast. So we had pre-planned who was going to offer the toast. I was off the hook because I was new. So they go around, and they toast with vodka, even at the science meeting. So they bring in, at the end of the meeting, they bring in this cart with these vodka shots. And there's all this etiquette. The women are allowed to just take a sip of the vodka, but the men have to take the whole shot. And if you don't do this, it's an insult. Like, you can't just say, oh no, I don't take vodka. No, you have to. And so they were warning us that the problem is, if it's a really good meeting, they could just go around and around on the toasts, and like, you have to arrange for transportation because people could be like drunk at the end of this meeting. Just, oh my gosh, I can't, so I was a little nervous just to see how this all works out. And we are taught here in this country to be very politically correct and inclusive. And that is not the case with the Russians. So Anessa, who's like this main high-ranking lady, we're on second, third round of toasts, and she said that this is clearly one of the most productive meetings that we've ever had with this international group. We accomplished all this stuff, and we did accomplish a lot. She's going through all the accomplishments. And she said, and do you know to what I attribute this great success? And then she said, it is because women outnumbered men in the room. Nostrovia, slams down her shot. And like, okay, so we have to pretend that we're like totally on board with this, but thinking, oh gosh, I never say that. Like, that was so.
I'm just imagining just a bunch of scientists getting absolutely hammered in Russia.
Oh, and at the conferences, they have, like, they're in these fancy theaters, not a convention center, with velvet seats, and they have like a quartet playing, and, just totally different science culture.
Wow. That sounds fascinating.
It's fascinating.
Oh my goodness. Okay. That actually leads really well into another question that we got, which was like, what is your most cherished, or like what is your most fun memory at NASA? This seems to be really, really high up there. I don't know if you've got another one that you're like cherish a lot more, or really good stories.
So working with the international partners in truly international interdisciplinary science was both frustrating and rewarding. So, I mean, I've already given you a couple glimpses into that. But the opportunity to travel to those countries and actually form meaningful relationships with those people, those are all really cherished memories, kind of in that category. And then the other category, I guess there's two other categories. One would be, because our research study was an exercise training for the entire spaceflight mission, we really got to know many of the astronauts really, really well. We'd test them like 20 times before flight and after flight, and we'd have to talk with them on video conference while they were in space and watch their exercise form if they were having problems. And so really getting to work with the crew members a lot, not just know who their name was also really interesting, because then they would share all kinds of fun spaceflight stories that you just think like, what? You did that? And things that don't make the news. And so that part was really fun. And then the other part that was fun was the operational spaceflight, the vibe of Johnson Space Center. There's this huge pool there where they do the EVA training, and there's like a mock-up of the space station. And we got to do some research there where we got to go in the pool and in boats in the pool. And they're developing a Mars rover, and it would drive around going to places. And if it saw you walking to another building, you could like hitchhike and they'd take you in, and you could take you to your next meeting, like drive you around. And a lot of little fun things like that. There's this gimbal machine that has like 8 degrees of freedom range of motion for unloading. So you could go in there and it felt like kind of like a marionette, for unloading. Just that kind of stuff.
Seems like a really fun time. Yeah.
The really feeling what it's like in spaceflight. My kids were little when we moved there, and my daughter went to the Johnson Space Center daycare like when she was 4, and one of the kids in class, her dad was on the space station, so he would do video downlinks with the class every week.
Oh, that's awesome.
And he took stuffed animals and read books, and it was fun to watch her grow up, like knowing all of this. And she was in 1st or 2nd grade, and she drew a picture of someone in space, and it was a girl, and her ponytail was floating up because she just automatically knew that that's what would happen to your hair in space. And so kind of living in that bubble was pretty cool.
Sounds phenomenal. Yeah. Anybody have any other questions for Dr. Ploutz-Snyder?
I had one more. So I was just reading some of the papers you were involved in where I think VO2 max tests were done like during space flight. And I think that's really cool because I work in a kinesiology lab where we do VO2 max tests all the time. So I just kind of wanted to ask, I know like as much as you can simulate like microgravity conditions on Earth, I guess like what are the limitations on the research you're able to do just because of like the nature of like, space flight being like a completely different environment, and like what strides are being done or like what research is unable to be done right now because of where that stands in terms of technology?
Oh, that is a great question. So we actually have a hard time getting papers published from the space station research because the reviewers feel compelled, I'm not judging, but they feel compelled to hold us to ground-based standards. So they don't like the VO2 max tests because the subjects conduct their own tests. And you don't necessarily see a plateau in VO2 max with increasing workload because maybe the person just quits because they got so tired. We do have a good calibration protocol, so that part is good. But there are tons and tons of limitations to this. Think of it as field-based research in an austere environment where the participants have to test themselves. So you can't do muscle biopsies. You can't do very many invasive techniques at all. A blood draw is about the max, but all they can really do is spin it down and freeze it. and then return it to Earth, hopefully mostly frozen. So there's a lot of limitations on what you can even analyze. We did do some fantastic remote guided ultrasounds where the crew members did their own ultrasounds, but with remote guidance. That is someone walking them through it and looking at the images as they collected them and said, no, back up a little bit, turn this knob, do that. So I say the VO2 max tests were pretty solid. The bike only goes up to 350 watts. So anyone who needed more than that was not going to get a perfect VO2 max test. And of course, the calibration and the programming of the protocol had to be preset. So if anything went wrong with that, you lost the test. And then the other big problem was the scheduling of the test. So for your research study, you could say that you needed a VO2 max test every 14 days or every whatever time sequence you needed for your study. And what that meant was they'd try to schedule it then. But I told you in the beginning, they schedule every 15 minutes. It might be that they got way behind and there was some emergency and you just can't do the test, or you were supposed to do the test, but not within 4 hours of eating. And you're faced with either do the test right after lunch or not at all. And so there's terrible experimental control, which is one reason why we did the bed rest study, because that is the other extreme. It's like super duper control.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Ploutz-Snyder. This has been really entertaining. It's good to learn more about your career trajectory, what you've done, get a funny story in there to kind of understand the culture at NASA and what's the field's really like. So we can't thank you enough for this opportunity to talk to you. We've been really looking forward to it, and it was fantastic.
Well, I'm glad I finally got it scheduled. And one parting thought as you're applying to medical school or deciding to do something else is you need to be able to have fun with your job. Mm-hmm. So if you're thinking about a job or you're in a job and you can't have at least some fun with that job, you should really highly consider another job.
Yeah. Especially with medicine, it can get really grueling, long hours and whatever. So right. You gotta be able to crack a joke once in a while.
Right. Well, I'm not saying every bit of a job has to be fun. That's a little unrealistic, but
yeah,
you need to be able to find some fun.
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you everybody for attending. It was really nice to have you all join. It's been a while. So hopefully you guys found this as interesting, informative, and funny as we did.
Well, it's nice to meet you all, and good luck with your applications and your finishing out the semester. Right, yep. The ends can't come soon enough for all of us, I think.
Really looking forward to it, and best of luck too for scheduling for the fall. You rattled off a few variables there, and it seemed like a lot of work, in terms of setting up classrooms.
It is. Be nice to your administrators. They're trying really hard, even if it looks like they're failing miserably.
Just trying to figure it out just like us, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Snyder. Yep. All right.